kick in. Hey, good morning, everyone. We've got another great guest today, Dr. Cindy, the author of Sell Yourself on Account-Based Friday. We're going to be talking all things brand today. And each week, as you know, we open with a poll, and the poll is actually related to Dr. Cindy's latest book, Sell Yourself. The question that I had posed was, what's the most important aspect of personal branding for a B2B marketer or seller, which is typically our audience that watches us each week? And I gave multiple choices here: value proposition or message, consistency across platforms. There's so many platforms now. Threads just came out. Authentic communication or other. And nobody filled out other. I think actually one person filled out other, but I put authentic communication, not knowing. I voted very early, not knowing that the majority of people would pick that. But Meg, I think you had a slightly different view on this poll.
Yeah, I picked unique value proposition. And it's funny because I thought about authentic communication, but then I thought sometimes you can be a little too authentic. And what one person thinks is authentic, another person thinks is oversharing or annoying or other things that you may not want. So I went back to, well, what's the core of really great marketing? It's what is special, what is unique, what is different. So I picked that one, but I did go back and forth on this one. But Dr. Cindy, I think we need to get your thoughts here. What say you on our poll? And thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. I loved this poll because you're absolutely right. It's actually all of them, all of the above. And the magic in this, but it is the magic in this, though, is the fact that you gravitated to one part of it. John gravitated to another. We are multifaceted brands. Every single person is different. So the way that you bring your brand to life is going to change based on which one you think is most important. So yours is about the core and selling proposition. John's is about the authenticity of how he brings it to the world. Someone else's may be about their consistency. It's literally all of the above and just how you bring it to life.
Yeah, well, that makes a lot of sense, and I can see, but you have a book titled "Sell Yourself," and I see in the background too another one. Every job is a sales job. We've talked about branding, but how do you see the selling component working with the branding component if we're thinking about all of those different things we need to be good at?
Yeah, great question. Everybody has a personal brand, whether they realize it or not. So let's just start there. You have one, whether you've sat down with a piece of paper and created it. You're actually also selling it already, whether you think you have a sales plan, whether you think you've thought about it, whether you've ever given it a thought whatsoever, because you're bringing yourself to the world every single day. And so that was what brought me to write the book, Sell Yourself, How to Create, Live, and Sell a Powerful Personal Brand, was because I recognized that people were selling themselves short. They were selling themselves incorrectly because they felt like marketing their brand was enough. Marketing is bringing it to the world. Selling it is proactively making sure others know how to continue to promote you.
Hey, that's an interesting thought on the selling versus marketing side of things. If you're kind of new to the whole concept, I mean, it's sometimes hard to get traction and start with the branding mentality or even the selling mentality. Where do you start?
So I invite people to continue to start with kind of where they're already at. Start from where you are. You don't have to go back to the beginning. You don't need to, create some big retreat where you get in touch with your inner child or something. Start where you're at and just look at your life and take an honest inventory about who you are out there right now, because whoever you are now is either working for you or, quite frankly, working against you. And so you want to make sure you're clear on who you want to be. What's the legacy that you want to lead? So I have this conversation with leaders all the time when I'm coaching them. You're leaving a legacy. Is it the one you mean to be leaving? And if it's not, let's take an inventory of what message is out there that's supporting the legacy you want, what's selling against the legacy you want. And it really does begin with kind of your own core values and who you want to be known as in the world.
Well, and I think that's an interesting question. Do you ever run into situations where somebody has kind of what I would refer to as an aspirational brand promise or an aspirational brand they'd like to get to, but it's pretty far away from where they are today? And if that does happen, what's some advice to get from where you are to where you'd like to be?
That's a really funny question, because when you ask that, I think about those singing shows where they show the auditions at the beginning and you're like, ooh, yeah, not for you. So that is what I would absolutely call an aspirational brand. But that's why that honest inventory is so crucial, because you have that brand out there. So if you continue to go after that aspirational brand, where like in the South, we call it big for your britches. If you're too big for your britches, you're selling that. So people are seeing that that is who you think you are, which is kind of fake. And it's not really authentic. They also see that you're not really genuine. And then it makes it harder for them to trust you. If I don't trust you, I can't advocate for you. If I don't trust you, I can't support you. And no sale happens without trust. So it really is important to look for that feedback. And I call them brand blind spots. We all have them, but that's also why you want to ask around. So as you're really taking that inventory, be honest. I mean, ask kids. Kids are 100% honest, right? But ask your colleagues, ask family, ask friends, ask acquaintances. What are the words you use to describe me? And it needs to go beyond mother, father, brother, cousin, manager. What are the core words that speak to the core value and the message you're trying to get out in the world? And if it's not in alignment with what you want to be known as, blind spot. So let's go fix it.
When you think about the branding process, there's so many new tools, or I say new, they've really evolved over the years. YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, Reels. Do you think much about the platforms of distribution of that message? And if so, like how do you think about that, or where do you think about that as part of your, your branding process?
So this is where it shifts from marketing to sales, because it depends on where you're getting the message out there. So the brand is now created. Now we have to bring it to the world. And I believe there's 3 steps. You create it, you live it, and you sell it. When you're living it and you're selling it, you use the old sales term, you fish where the fish are. So depending on who the audience is you're trying to reach and impact and influence, that determines where you are, if you're on Twitter or Facebook or YouTube or TikTok or whatever, and how you're interacting with that audience. But it really is the sales plan that you have for yourself. It's almost like if you had a product and you're bringing it to market, you know which stores it needs to be in, you know where you need to advertise, what magazines, what websites, where you need to boost. It's no different with your personal brand. It's just a slightly different go-to-market strategy.
John, when you were talking about all of those different channels, it brought to mind something interesting, I think, that is probably a tricky part of personal branding now, which is your sort of professional brand versus your non-work persona. And what are your thoughts on, do those need to be aligned? Does one help the other, or do you need to just keep those pretty separate?
So it's very funny, because I have a chapter in the book called Split Personality Branding, because we have that if we're not careful, where your 9 to 5 undoes your 5 to 9 or vice versa. And so usually there is some common threads. I can be a professional by day and then have a side hustle at night, and then also, volunteer in my community. Those are parts of you having a multifaceted brand. That's completely fine and normal. It's when they're in conflict with one another that it gets confusing. So I'll give you an example. There is a story in the book, and this young lady had 2 Instagrams, one where she was an investigative journalist, literally interviewing people very buttoned up, and another one where she was a model for swimsuits. And that's confusing. Do you want to be a model, which she was phenomenal at, or do you want to be an investigative journalist, which she was also phenomenal at? So the challenge was, how do people help her? How do people support her? How do people talk about her? What's the legacy she's going to leave? And if they're in conflict, that's where people get confused, and it actually creates distrust, because I don't know. Let's say that I want to invite you to a conference where there's going to be all these people that could hire you as an investigative journalist, but I'm not sure that's really what you want to be when you grow up. So I'm not going to bring you. Or I'm not going to talk about you, because again, I don't know if that's what you want to be. So it's really where they're in conflict with one another needs to be resolved. And it doesn't mean that I want everybody to hear this clearly. Doesn't mean you can't have lots of hobbies and lots of different things. I certainly do. But it's that there is some common threads around it. It's truly going back to what you were saying, Meg, like your unique selling proposition. What is it that you want to be known as? What makes you unique? You can be unique as a marketing professional, as a volunteer in your community, working at your kid's school, being a parent. It all works together.
And thinking of that uniqueness of the individuals, and thinking about the different segments of people. I mean, here we've got men and women on this call, and we may have different perceptions of personal branding just from a man and a woman perspective. We may have different perspectives, US versus non-US. Are you seeing any interesting trends there as part of branding across different unique demographics?
Oh, yeah. We could get into this. It's very interesting because it's certainly cultural based, right? So we sell differently to sort of different cultures. I travel internationally quite a bit. And so there are things that are inherently American traits, right? There are things that are inherently French traits or Austrian traits. You know, there's inherent things. But what's funny is when it comes to your own personal brand, it's really about how you bring it to the audience and knowing the audience and reading the room. And that's where I think a lot of people also forget that when you're selling yourself, you need to take into consideration some of those differences, because your message is going to land, and your message is you in a personal brand. It's going to land differently with a group that, you know, if I'm selling to a group of men, if I'm selling to a group of women, if I'm selling to a group of executives. So looking at some of those differences, and there are lots of trends out there right now that we're seeing changes, and people being more forthright with their voice and finding their voice and being very assertive. Knowing that, and let's say that that's part of my brand, I also need to read that room and know that maybe that's going to fall flat in some areas. So just recognizing that. And I actually talk about that in the book too, where I live in California now. I'm originally from the South. That's where the y'all comes from. But I was in the South speaking at a conference, and immediately I think I had been written off because they thought I was from the quote big city. And one of my friends, and I knew that was going to be a problem. So one of the first stories that I shared was about when I grew up in the South. And then all of a sudden it was like, oh, okay, she's not from the evil city. You know, she's not the big city gal. She actually understands it. So recognizing some of those pieces and the trends in the areas that you're trying to sell to as well.
Yeah, I think that's an important point is, you know, for in any great sales scenario, right? You're going to think about who am I selling to and what do they need? And it sounds like with personal branding, you need to think about that too. What holds people back from being able to define their personal brand and sell their personal brand? What are some of the things, you know, we should be aware of as we think about bringing ourselves to market?
I think the biggest thing that holds people back is the word sales because it feels icky. It feels, you know, I have this avatar in my mind of a salesperson, and I am a salesperson, by the way, but I have this avatar and I call him Tommy Two Thumbs, and he's the used car sales. Hey, what's it going to take to get you in this car? You know, we all have this mindset of a salesperson. And I think that's the biggest challenge for all of us, is to embrace the fact that every job is a sales job. You're selling, you've been selling your whole life. And I know this because we were all 5 years old, and 5-year-olds are the best salespeople on the planet. So I know you can do this. And so it's tapping back into that, but overcoming that fear of you're not going to be a manipulative salesperson. And I know this for a fact because you're aware of it. You know, you don't want to be that. So it's not going to be a danger, but it's getting over what I call the ick factor of selling is one of the biggest challenges. And that's also why people sell themselves short. They don't want to come across as braggadocious. They think that their work speaks for itself, or, oh, my friends all know me. They know that I want to start a company, or I want to go over here and do this. No, you're selling yourself short if you do that. You really need to be proactive about selling yourself and advocating for yourself and asking others to advocate for you as well.
Just thinking about that advocation on behalf of yourself, there are different types of people, introverts and extroverts. It may come to a surprise to many, but I'm actually very introverted in a very extroverted profession, marketing. And I've always wrestled with like that jump from being introverted to kind of putting yourself out there, although that will surprise a lot of people, I think. Do you have any advice for either specifically for introverts or maybe even for extroverts? Maybe they're too much or too extreme on the selling. I don't know. Like, how do you see the difference between the introvert and extrovert spectrum?
So I actually am with you on that, John. I think on every personality profile, I'm considered an extrovert, but I think I'm more of an introvert at the end of the day. So I understand that. But people always assume, oh, you have to be an extrovert to be good at sales. I actually disagree with that statement because I actually think introverts make better salespeople because they're better listeners. They establish trust faster, usually because they are better listeners. They speak with empathy. They don't say a whole lot. So when they do speak, it's very profound typically, and everybody listens because they're like, John said something. So, there is this sort of magic when you do say something in a group. So I think that introverts actually have a huge advantage. And it's funny you bring this up. I have a video that's in my resource vault called The Introvert's Advantage because I had so many introverts saying, but I can't sell myself. That's not me. That's not me. And I said, you're selling yourself already. You're absolutely doing that 100%. All I'm inviting you to do is do this with a little bit more purpose behind it and have a formula. It's kind of like you've been cooking for years and now you have a recipe. Just makes it a little bit easier.
What are some first steps that people can take? Especially, I know a lot of people make job changes or feel like they want to work towards whatever their next promotion might be, things like that. What are some first steps that people can take?
So that first step goes back to kind of what we talked about creating your brand and really creating the intentional brand. I have a bonus chapter that I talked about rebranding at work and then one when you are switching jobs and things like that, because I want people to recognize you have to be proactive in that moment. You have to really identify why you haven't gotten it already and be honest with yourself. Are you just expecting everybody to see your amazing brilliance? Well, if you're doing that, it's funny, and I have to say this, a lot of people say, oh, well, I'm going to be braggy if I say how great I am. No, what you're doing is being more narcissistic by assuming that the rest of the world is stopping everything they're doing just to pay attention to you. That's not happening. You have to be your own advocate. So the first thing is recognizing what it is you want and why you haven't gotten it. And is it that you haven't raised your hand? Is it that people don't see you in that light because you don't have experience yet or something of that nature? So you've got to kind of see where the disconnect is. Once you identify the disconnect, then you create the plan around it. Then you start looking for opportunities to raise your hand. You start finding those moments where you can say, I can do that. Hey, I'd like to be on that project. You start putting yourself out there in that way. And that's when you start to build and establish trust, but you're constantly seeking feedback because you're still a bit in the creation mode. So you're seeking feedback. How is this landing with the audience? Did they buy into it? That's the other thing I hear leaders say all the time. Well, I need my team to buy into it. What do you think that is? That's a sales conversation. So you're selling that into the group. And then that's the point where you get to start asking for people to advocate for you, ask for that support, and then continue to create that consistency. So that's where you want to start.
Thinking about starting and also thinking about your other comment about John being profound, you're really good for my ego on that, by the way. It doesn't work well with my daughters in terms of my profound sayings to my daughters, but thinking of my daughters who are college age and just emerging into the workforce and quote unquote starting, unlike Meg and I, who are a little bit more established in our careers, they are not. With that kind of segment, what recommendations or suggestions would you have for somebody brand new to the working world of what they should be doing to, sell themselves to their organization or just sell themselves, period?
Yeah. It's funny because I also wrote something specifically for grads in there because I wanted to make sure that they knew you have a responsibility, not just an opportunity, but a responsibility to brand yourself out of the gate. And I'll share with you part of where this book really started was when I was in grad school and I was about to defend my dissertation. And I had done all the work. I had passed the comps. I had done the research. I had done all the things. And a professor of mine pulled me aside and he said, before you go in there next week to defend your dissertation, just remember girls who look like you are not supposed to be smart. And I was kind of taken aback. I'm like, huh? Like, what do you mean by that? Like, of course I'm smart. Like, I did all the work. And what he was saying is the work isn't enough, that you have to be proactive about convincing them, selling them at the end of the day, that this is where you should be, because you're now becoming a colleague of theirs. You're no longer a PhD candidate. You're now a colleague. You're now a peer. You have to sell them on the fact that you deserve to be in that group. So that's what I would say to the new college graduate is your past work is great. And what you did in school, your jobs that you've had, the grades that you made, your GPA, your test scores, all of that's a great. Convince whoever it is that you're getting a job with that you belong in the cool kids club, and you sell yourself into that. And that begins with doing your research, know the company, know the company's goals, ask really good questions in the interview phase, create that brand around it. And the other thing I would also tell the newbies is sweep your social media, go in and do the inventory. It's not a bad thing that you had a wonderful college experience and you went on spring break with your with your friends, but that was kid stuff. So now when you look at the groups you want to be a part of, are those still the things you want out in the world? And I'll give you a quick story. Somebody who had bought and read the book messaged me on LinkedIn and said, I actually went back and I completely changed my social media after reading this because I didn't realize I was selling against my past. And that's what it was. She was in this new role, but her past was still out there creating that narrative. And so she was selling against her past.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I feel for young people now that have a lot of their life history out there. And to your point, some of those things might not be the way they'd want to be perceived by, a new manager or anyone for that matter. So that's, I think, a good cautionary tale. What about people who are, say a little more established in their career, who want to make a total change, who just say, now I'm doing X, I want to do Y. Any thoughts on the best ways to sort of build a new brand when you've already kind of built one in the past?
Yeah, for sure. So it's not a new brand, in my opinion. I think it's a rebrand. So you don't want to leave this stuff behind that was so great because you've got that. What you now want to do is build on the established trust in your current brand. So think about if you were launching a product, your company's parent name has great trust in the market. You're now launching a product that is part of that parent company. You're going to lean on that same thing. So look at the facets of your old brand that still fit. What are those multifacets that fit for the new brand? And then what are the ones that need to shift? What are the ones that need to change? And then start testing them. Just like in branding and just in like bringing a product, you're market testing, you're seeing how it sits, you're seeing where it lands, you're seeing how people, how's the traffic to the website? Are people commenting on things when you're putting new things out there? So that's the first place to start. And I'll give you an example. I have a friend who has been in corporate America for a very long time and is now shifting to wants to be a keynote speaker. And I'm guessing there's going to be a book in there somewhere as he gets going, but he's starting to put content out that's a little bit different. It's no more the corporate line. It's more his opinions and op-ed pieces and posting things that are more in line with his vision. And I'm seeing this, and I reached out. I was like, hey, I see what you're doing there. Like, I see that. But he's also listening to the feedback. And I noticed that on some of the things that he's posted, because some of them that didn't get a whole lot of comments, he's not staying on that thread. He's now going down the thread of where people were engaging. So it's the same thing when you're rebranding, you're market testing it. You're seeing how it's landing. You're seeing where people are reacting to your brand, where they're trusting in your brand. But the biggest piece where people miss in a rebrand, in my opinion, is they do not ask people to buy into the new brand. And we just assume that, oh, well, I've rebranded. Of course, you see, now I want to be a speaker. There needs to be an ask. There needs to be the request of, hey, Meg, John, will you help me find speaking gigs? Will you help me find a book publisher? Whatever it is his goal is. And we assume that because we have this new brand, everybody now knows the new plan. They don't. So make sure your fans and your support system know what rebrand you're trying to create so they can support you. Nobody does this life alone. We all got to help each other.
Yeah, the ask part struck like a lightning bolt with me. because that's not something I do a lot of, and I feel like I could be doing more of, quite frankly. So I could hear, I hear you on that loud and clear, that it does make a lot of sense to kind of make that tie, because sometimes you think you're doing all the work, but if you're not making the ask, all the work really doesn't matter. But maybe building on what Meg was saying about kind of the pivoting of brands, and you've generously donated a number of books to a veterans program that will be using this book to teach entrepreneurs that are veterans that are trying to start their own businesses. And their situation is not quite like Meg had described it, where they don't really have an established brand. They're establishing a new business after being in the service for X number of years. And really, it's a completely different foray that they're going into. In their situation, what words of wisdom would you offer if you were speaking directly to the class? Like, what would be the one or two things that you would share with them to really focus on, beyond, of course, reading the book, which they're going to get copies of? And thank you again for the donation.
It was my pleasure. It's a population I really want to help. And I think that, one thing that I would tell them is it isn't a start over. So just like if you're rebranding at work, they do have this military background. They do have skill sets that they learn that are absolutely transferable. Lean into those. Former military leaders actually make really good salespeople because they have structure, and true sales is both an art and a science. And so I can teach them the structure as long as they've got the fire in the belly to be able to go and make it into art. So I invite them to look at truly what it was that you learned in your military time. What do you want to take with you? What do you want to leave behind? And that's okay too. But then start recognizing, okay, what that transferable skill set is that I'm going to take forward. So you want to start a company and you need to be a CEO. Great. You have leadership skills that you've learned. You learned discipline. You learned authenticity. You learned, authoritative speaking. You learned persuasion. You learned all of that. All of that still speaks to the brand. Here's where I would invite them to consider maybe doing a little bit more of a deeper dive. A lot of times when people are shifting industries, and that's what I would call that, military industry versus, business industry, they think that they don't belong. And so they have this sort of a mental cattle guard is what I call it. This thing where it's like, but I'm not supposed to be here, and people are not going to believe that I should be here because I don't have this experience. Let that go, cross that cattle guard, because if you have the desire to do this, the mission needs to be greater than the fear. And that's what I would tell them. And that's what I would tell anybody that's kind of shifting in that space is, if your mission is greater than your fear, you can do this. Give yourself permission to make that switch. Do not give yourself a mental cattle guard that is keeping you from this rebrand.
Gotcha. I think, Meg, we're just about at time here, but any closing thoughts on your side?
No, I think that what you just said is really, really important. I think that whatever it is you want to achieve needs to be greater than your fear about what it's going to take to achieve it. I'm actually putting that in the chat because I don't want to forget that. I think that's a wonderful way to end our discussion and to go into the rest of our day and the weekend. Thank you so much for being with us today.
It's been a pleasure. This was great fun. I feel like we could have talked all day.
Yeah, Dr. Cindy, really appreciate you getting up a little early on the West Coast to join us. Excellent content today. And if you haven't already seen our book in the background and the book that I'm sharing here, it's on Amazon. You said it was on, I guess, still on sale. It sounds like from Prime days. Yeah. So definitely go grab that. And you've got the other book too. Every Job is a Sales Job. So you got a couple books to choose from. So thank you for joining us. And next Friday, we've got AI and RevOps. I've got an expert leader, Tom, formerly from Sendoso, now with Charlie Mike Capital, Tom Pei, who will be sharing what he's learned around RevOps and AI and automating some of the RevOps functions via AI. So should be a really interesting conversation. Thanks again.
Definitely.